Good evening. I welcome you today to this joint community conversation with Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center mayors and chiefs. I am Dr. Ida Watts, Associate Vice President of Equity and Inclusion with North Hennepin Community College in Brooklyn Park. And the purpose of our meeting today, although the killing of Mr. George Floyd did not take place in the Brooklyns, this kind of egregious police conduct erodes community trust, particularly in Black and brown communities. So I commend the mayors and police chiefs of Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center for prioritizing this communication today. They are here to be with you, with the community, to answer your questions and listen for possible ways forward. Under normal circumstances, we would likely have a large, open community meeting and set it up as a listening session. Given this pandemic, we have to be creative. So thanks for being with us virtually this evening. Please do share your questions and ideas in the Facebook comments. For the format tonight, I'm going to introduce the mayors and the police chiefs, and they'll each speak briefly. And then we'll take your questions, starting with some that were emailed in advance. Special thanks to the Organization of Librarians in Minnesota, who suggested last week that we hold a meeting like this, as well as members of the multicultural advisory committees from both cities, who are also with us tonight. So I would like to introduce to you Mayor Elliott, Chief Gannon, Mayor Lundy, and Chief Envelson. Mayor Elliott, let's begin with you. What statements would you like to share with our community?
Well, thank you. This is obviously, we're gathered under circumstances that none of us imagined. It is with great sadness that we're here to address our communities about what happened nearly just over a week ago now. We all watched just about at the same time the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed man who was encountered by Minneapolis police officers, and we witnessed an officer put his knee on the back of his neck, held it there for over 8 minutes until the life went out of his body, even against the backdrop of passerbys, citizens, insisting, urging the officers to release the pressure that they were applying to Mr. Floyd's neck. On that day, we all witnessed what people of color, particularly Black men, experience all the time, all too often, at the hands of police in our society. On that day, despite George Floyd's pleads, despite his crying out loud for his mother, despite articulating clearly that he could not breathe, that he was being hurt, his voice went unheard. Now all of us are captured by the moment. We're all asking ourselves, what is it that we need to do in this moment? And because the conditions that led to Mr. Floyd's killing are so pervasive in our society, we all have to do the serious work of making sure that each of us take on the responsibility to dismantle the systemic racism that exists in our society. So this is a conversation that's well overdue. It's long overdue, but I'm happy that at least what it has brought us to is to have this community-wide conversation and to galvanize all of us to action, as dark as these times are.
Chief Gannon, your words to the community.
I've been thinking about that for over a week now. I've been asked quite a bit, how do I feel about what happened? What are my emotions? And I have to say, what I feel about and what I think about is secondary to a family that's grieving. That's obvious. But when I'm asked as a 26-year police veteran of a city that I've been privileged to serve, that's being Brooklyn Center, I have a lot of thoughts and I had a lot of concerns, and the biggest one obviously was anger, because what I saw by that police officer is not what I believe our profession stands for. It's not what I believe I've trained my officers to do. It's not what I've been trained to do. What I saw there was a full disregard for the oath of office that officer took, and all the partners that were surrounding him. I was very angered and saddened by the fact, because I knew with the same broad brush, my partners in all the metro agencies, all police officers across the country are going to be painted with that broad brush. And it's not fair, but it is what we're going to deal with, and it's what we're going to work through, because there is injustice. That was a grave injustice to that man and to his family and to the community. We see what's happening now. We see the anger. We see the protests that are so meaningful in this time that it's very upsetting to me. And I've had a number of conversations with my officers, and I tell you that for a fact that every one of my officers I've talked to feel the same way that I do. That what we saw there was obviously unlawful, criminal act, and they were very disappointed. Chief Ingvelson and myself worked very hard in the two Brooklyns to bridge gaps with the community, to make sure that voices are heard. And we see this happen in Minneapolis, it throws us back a lot farther than we want to be put. We do a lot of hard work in our cities, and we're going to continue to do that, and we're going to have to step up our game, obviously, and work very hard to build the bridges back that we feel that we have in our community.
Mayor Lundy, your words.
I think on behalf of Brooklyn Park, the City Council, myself, I just want to express our condolences and our thoughts with the family of Mr. Floyd, his loved ones, his families, his neighbors, his friends, who've told many eloquent stories about his life and how full of life he was until that encounter. I think that there's that full range of emotion, from sadness to grief to shock, and frankly anger. I think everybody's got to anger, because we're just like, how the hell can somebody think that is appropriate to treat someone like that? I can't fathom the thought process of where did someone come that someone else's life is worth that little. And so I think we as a community have really felt that. And I think as this process, we know that we've spent a lot of time on My Brother's Keeper, Cities United. We preach and we preach and we preach about we need to be active in roles. We need to try to find ways to kind of bend the curve the other way, to find ways that we can find opportunity. And we know that what happened last week shakes all that to the core, and that we need to approach this as we need to start from zero again. Because in a human relationship, if someone feels like you've lied to them, you don't just start at zero, you start at like -10. You start just to get back to the place where you might earn trust, you have to work extra hard. And so I look at tonight not as a journey, it's a start. And we're gonna have lots of listening. That's how Brooklyn Park does it. whether it's immigration, whether it was the youth, whether it's parks, we always start with a conversation. Then we talk about what we might do, and we go back to the residents and ask them, what do you think? And then we come back and we talk again. And so for me, this is obviously, with COVID, we couldn't have what we would have, which is a big meeting. We have people there. And so we're trying to find those alternate ways, because it is so vitally important that we come back to our residents, who are our core, and listen. And so I know that, the Brooklyns, we live, eat, and preach this all the time, and that we're committed. We're here. We're not going anywhere. This work is too important to throw up our hands, walk away, and say it can't be fixed, because I believe it can. I believe it could. I believe it will. And so tonight is just a step in a longer process, and we're going to continue to walk through that with everyone.
Chief Envelson.
It's been over a week, a little over a week, and I would say that my emotions have evolved over time. The first I saw the video was that Tuesday morning, and it started with absolute utter disbelief in what I was seeing. Unlike, similar to Chief Gann, and I've been doing this 29 years, I watched a lot of videos involving our officers and officers across the country, and I've never seen anything like that in my life. So I started with disbelief, and from there it evolved into disappointment, disgust, and an utterly indefensible act that was committed by somebody that wears the same badge that we do. And it's now turned to anger. What we all witnessed was a criminal act. It was murder, and they're being treated as such. The part that I've really struggled with is, my mayor called me that morning. I've had friends call me. I've had neighbors talk to me and ask me, what happened there? They're looking for some kind of plausible explanation as to why a police officer would do something like that. I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for them. We don't train that way. No police agency in this entire state, in this country, treats somebody like that or applies that kind of pressure to someone's neck. That was not a police tactic. That was not something that we train on. It was not something that, it was not a tactic that was used inappropriately. It was not a tactic that was done too long. It was not a police tactic. It was murder. And the real frustrating part, I know I can speak on behalf of every officer in my department that I've talked to, they're all just as disgusted as well. And the feeling that they have right now is they feel like all the work that we've done in earnest, going back to some other incidents that have occurred within the metro area, is we've just taken 20 steps backward. Even though it did not occur in our city, officers are viewed the same. When one does something egregious, that gets applied to all of us. So they're disappointed.
So that leads to our very first question, which is to both of the chiefs. Understanding what the culture can be in many police forces, and that culture can many times prevent an officer from reporting concerns, from coming forward. What exactly is the protocol for officers to report their fellow peers if there are concerns of racism or discriminatory practices or language?
I can start. So going back to when I first started with the police department, a senior officer, and it wasn't necessarily related to race or to seeing improper conduct, but he leaned in and he said to me, he said, new officers should be seen and not heard. And I took that to heart, and I thought, that is a terrible thing to say. I had a whole lot of life experiences, a lot of officers that come from different backgrounds, different experiences. They have a lot to share. And what I've tried to foster within the department from any point that I've been in this leadership role, is to make sure that every voice can be heard. Every officer, no matter how junior, you can step up and say, that's wrong. I know that's wrong, because my moral compass tells me that's wrong. And I don't care if you're senior to me, but I'm not going to let you do that. So I've tried to foster that within the agency, and to be honest with you, it starts from the top down. So it's the leadership that has to express the fact that every voice can matter, every voice should point out improper conduct. And if you have that as a baseline, then everybody can speak up, and everybody can watch each other, and everybody can police each other. And in that way, everybody does a better job. And it's not just the senior officers that we have to lean on, but it's every officer that comes. I have officers that have been in refugee camps as young adults, and they have great experiences to bring to bear to the community that we serve in Brooklyn Center. You better believe their voices are going to be heard. So that's how I've tried to foster a more positive relationship, that everybody can speak up. If you see something wrong, say it. And you know what? That's what you wear the badge for. And it's not just for citizens, it's also for your fellow people that are side by side with you in uniform.
Officer Gannon and I are dating ourselves this evening. As I said, I've been around 29 years, and that was the police culture when we started, is you're to be seen and not heard as a new police officer. I can share with you that policing has evolved dramatically since that time. And from our department's perspective, where that needs to be ingrained is in our field training program when they first come to us. It also comes to us when we have our potential new recruits go through psychological testing. We test for some of those things related to racism or the ability to speak up. And lastly, I think when we introduced the body camera idea in 2016, my entire department pleaded for the body cameras, because they do the right thing, and they want to be able to, that they do prove, or that they do the right things. So I think we've given them the tools and put those things in place that don't allow for the quote-unquote blue line of silence, or thin blue line, or the code of silence.
So this question comes from a Brooklyn Park resident, and I will open this up to whoever would like to answer. It's also a question that I identify with as both a African American woman, the mother to a child who is African American, and also married to an African American man. And it's been very difficult for me. So this is a mother, and her question is, she is concerned about raising her boys in a community that least understands the struggle they face even before they are born. So what programs can be made to involve Black males in city programs and decisions?
I think one thing that in Brooklyn Park we've done is we've been a founding member of Cities United, My Brother's Keeper, which is a President Obama initiative, which is targeted right for young males of diverse backgrounds. And the fact that by the time they get to 18, the lack of opportunities and what they face in their life didn't start at 18. It didn't start at 16, 14, 12, 10. It started at birth, and all those little factors in life kind of started to turn them to a place where they end up when they're 18, they have those lack of opportunities. And so we've been trying to be very apparent and forthright on trying to break down some of those barriers, and also try to find out where at 3 years old does things start to change. What can we do to help 3-year-olds be successful when they're 18? And so we've been trying to get youth engaged into that process and say, you own this. It's not the mayor who's leading this. We have a youth cohort. They lead that effort. And so we're constantly trying to refine that and trying to put their opinions at the forefront, not the mayor's opinion, but actually their opinions of what they need. And so one thing that we've done in both Brooklyns we've cooperated on is we do a youth survey where we go out in the community, youth go out and survey youth and ask them, how do you feel? Do you feel safe in your home? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? Do you feel safe in your city? What are your challenges? What are your needs? And we continue to try to reassess that process. And so what we try to do is say, come on in. If you have ideas, whether you're 5, whether you're 10 or 15 or 18, they play a role because you have something I don't have. I don't know what it's like to be an African American male at 5 years old. No experience. So they're the expert compared to me, so that we can bring those kids in and their parents and start to say, what can we do to change some of that? It's a generational effort. It took us generations to get here. It's going to take us generations to get out, I'm afraid. And so we just try to put it forefront, other people's truth and other people's experience.
Okay, would someone?
Certainly,
Mayor
yeah,
Elliott?
I'll take. Can you repeat just the last tail end of that question?
Certainly. What programs can be made to involve Black males in city programs and decisions?
Certainly. Now this, I think that's an excellent question. First of all, I want to say that we're open to ideas, to folks to come up and say, here's where I think that I would like to help, or where I think a group of us can help. But generally speaking, I became mayor about 1.5 years ago. And the one thing that I've really pressed on has been community engagement. The chief, I think, can back me up on this, has been community engagement. Because I fundamentally believe in order for us to have government work best for the people that it serves, the people have to be at the table when these decisions are being made. And so at every city council meeting where we have attendance, we have people who perhaps don't normally come to these city council meetings. I always give them a chance to participate and to speak up and to make sure that their voice is part of the process. We have to think about doing city making differently. The mayor of Minneapolis spoke shortly after George Floyd was murdered, and he said something in addition to calling for the officer to be arrested and charged. He said that the walls in the institutions like city government have many rules or norms baked into them, and certain ways of doing things and processes that in so many ways have to be reevaluated because they set the table for what can happen, who can be involved, and how they can be involved. And so we have city commissions that are open right now that folks can get involved with. These commissions look at housing policy in the city. They look at planning for the city, what buildings, what amenities, what facilities come to our city. What is the layout of our city gonna be in the coming years? Zoning decisions. We know the legacy of zoning in this country. So right now at Brooklyn Center, we're undertaking a process where we are rezoning on a large scale. So these are some of the tangible opportunities where I would highly encourage, send me an email, let me know that you're interested, because those decisions, that get made in those commissions go up to the city council and then they're voted on. But find a way to tune into your city council meeting and find out what's going on. What happens at the state level is incredibly important, and at the federal level, but the city level is where the rubber meets the road. It's where I believe you're most impacted. The quality of your life is most impacted. But we have to, all of us, get involved in city making. We have to be informed. We have to educate ourselves. We have to show up. We have to say, when the budget is being discussed, we have to show up and take part of that process and say, why aren't we emphasizing this? Why aren't we emphasizing these type of programs in our community? Why aren't we putting resources over here? So I think that's an excellent question. Ultimately, government has to work for the people that it serves. And so I welcome anyone who has an idea about how to get involved or wants to get involved to reach out to me.
And Mayor Lundy, for young men that are interested and have been vocal in wanting a men's center, what would be the steps that those men of color can take to move that along?
Yeah, I think first and foremost we start with the conversation about what they're trying to do. I think one of how I approach my role as mayor is I'm a connector. I don't have a lot of power. People think you do, but at the end of the day, sorry, Mayor Elliott, and I think I agree that there's not a lot we can just wave a magic wand and it happens. But what we can do is connect people with resources and assets. And so sometimes people come to me, I have an idea, and I'm stuck at this one point. And sometimes it's like, I love the idea. Have you thought about this? Because we can help here and here. And so what we try to do is connect people. That when we find people who have passion to help, and then we connect them with people in need, and we try to put those two together. And so I think that as people have come and talked about different needs, we have a large immigrant community, many different cultures, and all of them have very different distinct styles of way they approach things, is that we try to take them at where they are in their place and their communication, and then match ours to them. We don't ask them, come talk to us in the way that city people talk to city hall people. We try to have our conversation at whatever level and cadence they want to. And we also try to be real. One thing I think I try to always tell people is the truth, which is we can try this. This is going to be very difficult. I never promise things, because a promise unkept is the worst promise of all. And so we just try to make sure that we can connect people, because sometimes people think, I have this great idea and there's no way it's ever going to happen. Well, it'll never happen if you don't ask. And it'll sure in the heck happen if you don't try. And so that's one of the things we try to make. And sometimes an idea turns into something else. So.
Thank you. Chief Envelson, this question is to you from Brooklyn Center MAC members. In Minnesota, a black person is 13 times more likely to be killed by police than a white person. What is the Brooklyn Center Police Department doing to remedy this disparity?
I could take that as a Brooklyn Center, please, Chief, if that's all right.
Thank you.
It's recognizing and acknowledging the numbers and the ratio that's given, and knowing that there's unconscious bias that goes through a lot of these decision-making processes, and evaluating every use of force. So even before you get to the use of deadly force, you evaluate the use of force from the lowest levels. As police chiefs, we're able to do that. We assess and evaluate, and we can break that down on individual officers. So every night, and I won't speak for Craig, but I'll speak for myself, I'm very thankful that I know the name of, oftentimes the spouse of, every one of my officers that reports to the Brooklyn Center Police Department. I'm lucky to have that. Now, the chief of Minneapolis doesn't have that same luxury, but I get to know each one of my officers. I get to know their preferences, what they like, what they don't, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and that's how we can address a lot of these things as we go forward. So I am blessed with having that size of a department, but I also recognize that it's on me to find those issues where you see unconscious bias, where it might be in certain areas, and you look at the training that's available, and recognizing the fact that everyone has unconscious bias. It's just recognizing that fact and seeing how is that put into practice. And if it's put into practice in use of force issues, even deadly force issues, then it has to be addressed immediately, and it has to be corrected. And if it can't be corrected, then that officer needs to be removed.
Thank you. And being that this is such an important question, I am going to volley it over to our Brooklyn Park Chief.
Thank you. The question was related to deadly encounters. And regardless of someone's skin color, we train at the Brooklyn Park Police Department to not to have to get to that stage of an encounter, meaning that goes to the de-escalation training that we've had related, to mental health and some other things. It also requires effective and hands-on supervision. Any use of force that is conducted within the Brooklyn Park Police Department is reviewed by no less than 4 sets of eyes. That goes from reviewing the body cam video all the way through to reviewing the police report to make sure that the facts and circumstances that led up to that use of force, were there opportunities in there to go in a different direction that could have prevented us from using a use of force. So that provides further training on lessons learned from where we're at. So I would say, regardless of someone's skin color, our desire to limit our use of force, and obviously specifically our use of deadly force, we train not to get to that position.
Just add one thing, and it's to echo on what the chief said, is when you review these use of force incidents, when it gets to that point, when you look at it and is it appropriate, okay? But was it necessary? That's the key question that we're asking now, is that why did it have to get to that point? Yes, the use of force was what was needed at that time, but what led up to those factors? What was the verbal dialogue? What was the officer presence? What was your stature? There's so many different situations where you can go back and evaluate, was there something that you gave as a cue to the individual that escalated the situation. And that's when we get into de-escalation training and knowing, creating distance, tones, different ways that you talk to people. These are all things that are very important.
So speaking of tones and being aware, that's a great segue to our next question. What are your plans, if any, to embed cultural awareness and racial sensitivity into your respective police departments, again, if it's not in place already?
I can speak to that. You know, Brooklyn Park's demographics really began to change going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, and we found ourselves thrust into confrontational type of situations because of those cultural differences. So over 15 years ago, you know, Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center developed what is called, you know, the Joint Community Police Partnership, which has evolved into the Multicultural Advisory Committee, those kind of things. But we really learned early on, you know, 15 years ago, that we need to understand people's cultures to effectively police. We were having a lot of confrontations on traffic stops and other things because what their expectation had been in the country that they came from in dealing with police was much different than the expectations and desires of their local police department. So the only real new training that we've infused within the past 2 years would be our implicit bias training. We had never done implicit bias training up until the last couple of years. I know part of that is a legislative mandate as well, but we have began doing that kind of work. From a cultural sensitivity perspective, we've been doing it for a long time, and I know the city in general has taken that up as a cause quite heavily over the last several years.
Okay.
Can I add on something?
Yes,
to that?
yes, please.
I think one thing is, you know, people talk about languages, right? That, you know, people speak a language. I used to do international sales, and it was never the language that was most important, it was the culture. Is if you could speak the culture, you could be successful. And I think that's one thing in our both diverse cities, and so many, the diversity is diverse in itself, is that it's hard for officers because they have to be culturally aware, and culturally aware of those cues and those languages and those habits, so that they understand what may diffuse a situation in one culture may infuse a situation in another culture. So continually learning how to do that. I know both the Mayor Elliott and I are always aware that different cultures have different cues and how we approach them, and officers deal with people at a much more frequency. So, you know, being aware, I think, of how that culture plays. You know, everybody says, "Oh, you speak English, right?" Well, guess what? If you go to New York, Alabama, Minnesota, California, 4 different cultures, 4 different ways of doing things. We may all speak English, but the way we react to things is completely different.
Let me, if I may. I think Mayor Lundy makes a very compelling point about culture differences between, you know, Alabama and New York and whatnot. But I would also suggest that, you know, there are differences between Anoka and Minneapolis, or, you know, so we have to look at the training programs that we have in place to make sure that our officers have that cultural competency to really understand the communities that they're policing if they don't live there. I think we also have to increase and bring up to par the number of officers that live and represent the communities that they're policing. I think that is an incredibly powerful thing for a department to have officers who really understand the communities that they're operating in. There was a Star Tribune article in 2017 that looked at Minneapolis police officers, and only 8% of them live in Minneapolis. Only 8%. And the reality is that if you look at culture and you look at making sure that officers are understanding the environment in which they're operating, you need to have a certain percentage of people who are local to that community so that the department overall can really benefit and function well. The other thing I think we need to make sure that we're doing is when we have these use of force incidents, we have to press for answers. We have to make sure that we have transparency, because, for me, in my mind, transparency is central to making sure that there's justice done in each of these cases, and making sure that we have the accountability so that we're not repeating ourselves. We're not repeating these instances. We have to look at the use of force policies that are very similar across all departments, in fact, throughout the United States of America. We have to seriously look at those use of force policies and evaluate them. And we have to have community involved in that process. That is a commitment that I have, and I know the chief shares in the sense that we have to have the stakeholders, the people who are at effect to these policies, involved in making sure that that these are policies that are going to work in a way that are going to keep the community safe. It's not very often that we look at these policies, and many of these policies have existed for a very, very, very long time. And we know that the community has changed. We know that the world has changed. We also have to make sure that, as the chief mentioned, implicit bias training, and finally, what I will say is that the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, had a working group look at these violent encounters over a period of time, and they, in February, released their guidelines and recommendations. And so I call on all of our communities in the working group, which consisted of folks from all over Minnesota, including communities that are not in the metro, to evaluate these circumstances and put together this set of recommendations that our city council is going to be looking at in an upcoming work session. And that the Attorney General and the working group has called on all of our institutions to adopt those recommendations, and has called on the legislature. And the legislature is right now in the process of putting some of those recommendations in various bills to make sure that we can finally get the scourge, on our community of Black and brown people being killed in an outsized proportion to the portion of the population that they represent. So I mean, there are lots of things that we can do, but I think that we have to act now in this moment. And again, like I said, all of us are. It is incumbent upon all of us to get involved to make sure that these types of changes are being instituted in each of our cities.
So you speak to many poignant points. You speak to the importance of cultural competence, to transparency, and to taking action. And a community member has the question of forming a community police review board. So this question is to all of you. What are your thoughts on that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's been looked at throughout the country, and what we would need to make sure that we one of the biggest hurdles for a civilian review board is what data is that they can even review. So under data practice rules, if there's personnel data, training data, a lot of other data, that is confidential or private information that cannot be shared in a oversight committee. So I've seen across the country, and even in some local jurisdictions that have tried to stand something like that up, they get very frustrated because they will have a law enforcement member as part of that, but what the law enforcement agency reviews is different than what the civilian review board reviews, so that when it does get to the police chief and there's a recommendation, there's a lot of facts that they might not even know. And it leads to a lot of frustration in that we made a recommendation based upon what we knew and what we had at the time, and you went against that decision and you can't share with me why you went against that decision. So for that to be an effective tool, there would have to be some legislative work that would be done as well. And then if I could just have 10 more seconds going back to the earlier question, I think it's important for the community to understand that both departments are more than willing and able to open up our policy manuals and go through that and look for opportunities related to use of force. I just wanted to make it very clear to the community that what you saw in that video, you're not going to find in anybody's policy manual under use of force. The no agency trains to do what you saw on that video. So if the community feels like if I can just get into the policy manual and find that why do they kneel on people's necks and stop that, we can prevent this from happening again, that's a falsehood, and it's something that's not going to be there. Again, we're more than open to doing it. I just want to make sure that we're clear on what use of force policies do and do not dictate.
The mayor talked about the recommendations that recently came out in the winter and early spring, and part of that was it didn't just list what departments would be doing, but it also listed a number of different in the hierarchy as far as what Department of Public Safety would be implementing, what would the BCA be implementing. So it was a lot of tasks for a lot of different entities, and in some of those there was oversight over certain things that looked at like a larger body. I think within the city of Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, those types of review committees would be difficult to keep up and running, but it is something that we would look at as a potential. But for many of the same reasons that Chief Angleson talked about, it is very difficult with the information sharing, and we want, if you're going to make a decision, you want to have it be an informed decision. So what information could we have that we could pass on that could be reviewed by everyone, and they could make an informed decision? So it is not something that I'm opposed to. It's just something that I think there are things in the movement already as far as how do we get greater oversight, and I think that may be coming in whether at a higher level than individual cities. But again, as the chief did talk about, that maneuver, that physical action is not in anybody's policy manual. It doesn't exist.
I think something it's been kind of upsetting to me is the fact there is a review board right now. Every city has one. It's called the City Council and the Mayor. And I know some cities have talked about, oh, we need an outside board, we need this and that. I think that's BS. We have people who have oversight over police departments, and they exist right now, and that's your elected leaders. And so when I see some of the events that have happened in Minneapolis, and I hear people talk about, oh, if we just had this, you have the people who should be having oversight. And if there are policies that should be changed, there is a duly elected body that can pass policies to make changes. That is clear as day. They exist now, and it's just about the will to act. We've worked with our police department and the community, talked about body cameras. We went through a testing phase where we actually had the public comment. We did some sample videos so people could see not just the view of the body cam, but the peripheral view, what's going on behind the scenes that you may not see on a camera, to prepare people for the fact that the camera only covers what it's pointed at. Not all threats and actions happen on camera that lead to actions by police officers. So we try to do that. We have policies on the fact that if a person believes that their rights have been deprived of their rights by the police department, there are multiple different ways that they can have Human Rights Commission has purview over a complaint against our police department. They take that, there's a filing process, it goes outside the city manager, it goes outside the city council, it goes outside the police department, it files right with Human Rights Commission. So there are ways, and so when I hear that, I think it is a good idea, but what people are really asking for is give me some oversight. Give me some people who are gonna look at these things and make changes, and I would argue that us elected officials are those people, and if we're not acting, then I think at the next election, people should act on that. It is there. And so I believe fully that having your elected officials accountable for those things it's very important.
Now, speaking of holding folks accountable and understanding the pain that community members are going through, Mayor Lundy, this question is for you. This community member is concerned, wondering about having school resources school resource officers in the school system. Mm-hmm. So the question is, should that continue, and what can you share with community members that have that concern?
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have, because I actually was privileged for 1 year to be the volunteer coordinator at Evergreen Park Elementary, which is an elementary school in Brooklyn Center. And so it gave me the firsthand glance of seeing kids, elementary kids who have suffered trauma, watching maybe their parents being taken away by a police officer. And then they see a school resource officer, and some of that trauma is relived because there was kids who were afraid we'd bring Brooklyn Center council members and police officers and firefighters that would come in and serve lunch. And I knew that there were certain kids that we had to account for because of trauma in their life. So it's not a one-all. But I think that's a good conversation to have with the schools, to have that conversation with everybody involved. I would just share this story because it really is impactful, is that we build a lot of relationships with kids, and that's one of our goals, whether it's my goal, whether it's staff's goal, whether it's police goal, firefighters, is to get with those kids because we want them to be firefighters, police officers, elected officials, and so on. So in Brooklyn Park, we had a circumstance. Lieutenant Weinbach was a school resource officer at Champlain Park High School and Park Center. And she formed relationships. And she started to meet these girls, and they were pregnant. And these are West African, Liberian girls. And she was trying to figure out why they were, all of them were getting pregnant at the same time. And what was going on. And they shared with her because they trusted her, because of the relationships formed, that they were being sex trafficked. That's why they were getting pregnant, because they were being forced to be sold out because of people who were taking advantage of their circumstances. And so that trust from those kids, because they trusted Lieutenant Weinbach, led to the fact that we realized we had a sex trafficking ring operating in the Brooklyns and that they were using Liberian girls to traffic. From that process came the fact that Brooklyn Park, with Assistant Brooklyn Center, we built the first suburban teen homeless shelter. And it all was born out of the fact that our school resource officer had relationships that they built. We would never have known that. So I know there's some things that we need to figure out, and there's some things that we need to account for, but I've seen what happens. That teen homeless shelter would never have happened if Lieutenant Weinbach did not have relationships to ask those girls what is going on, and for those girls to have the trust to share with them that they were being trafficked and that they were pregnant because of strangers they didn't know. And so I use that as an example because people talk about all the bad stuff that happens, and we should account for that, but there is a lot of good stuff. There are kids who know their officers still from when they're in middle school, and they still talk to them. So I think it's a great conversation, but I tell that story because it is absolutely the truth. Anybody who wants to see the homeless shelter, you can go see it, and you'll know that that is the story, that how it happened. And so have the conversation, but just be aware there is some really good stuff that happens when kids form relationships with adults and they tell things. And so that one is core to my heart about we would not have that shelter if it wasn't for that relationship formed when those girls are in middle school with that school resource officer.
Mayor Elliott.
Yeah, certainly. I echo a lot of the sentiments that Mayor Lundy just said. Thinking about my own experience at Brooklyn Center High School, we had a school resource officer, Officer Bill Concord. To this day, he's still very beloved. I can probably count on one hand the number of times I saw him in uniform. He, always dressed in a suit and a tie, and was always very nice. Had great relationships with just about every student. I think it's a matter of, I think we do have to have this conversation because I think it matters how that officer presents in the school. I think it also matters how that officer's how that resource is used in the school. Because I think Mayor Lundy is right. For a lot of students, that might be a trigger to relive those traumatic moments that they've experienced where police has been present. But I think it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. Going back real quick to the Community Oversight Board conversation, I just don't want to miss the opportunity to comment on that. I think that's, like Mayor Lundy said, that is the role that City Council can play and should play. But I think that there is a role for the community to play as well in a sort of larger oversight of policing of their community. And to the extent that that's been preempted by the legislature in terms of data practices laws, right now, I think everything needs to be on the table. We need to look at all of the pieces of paper that have writings on them that have implications for how our society functions. These are laws that are on the books that we have to look at. How do they fit in today's environment in 2020?
Yes.
I would just like to touch on the SRO thing. I won't get into all the details. I think it would be a grave mistake to remove police officers from the school, and I won't get into all the reasoning behind that. I welcome the conversation with school boards. If they choose to go that route, I'll be more than happy to come out and talk to school boards about why I think the officers should remain in the schools. The other thing that I just wanted to share is there's a lot of emotion right now, and rightfully so. And as Mayor Lundy had said earlier, we're here to start this conversation. And what's concerning to me is a lot of decisions are getting made very rapidly because it seems like it's something we should do. As far as disconnecting relationships with police departments, specifically Minneapolis police, these kind of things. And I'm not saying that potentially that might be the right solution, but I think we need to just slow down for a minute, let the emotions come down a little bit, and then let's have those discussions about SROs and some other things. Because there are a lot of unintended consequences, good and bad, that can come out of decisions that are made when you're very emotional.
Chief Gannon, you had your hand up.
All I had to say was basically we have one SRO for the city of Brooklyn Center, and I could see the smile that came to Mayor Elliott's face when he thought about Billy Conkar. But what I'd like to say is that if there are a movement to remove SROs, police officers, from the schools, I beg the superintendents and the principals to continue to allow police officers in non-enforcement roles to interact with the kids and the youth that are in the schools. We have a lot of positive interactions when we do different things with kids in the schools, whether it be recess or reading, not just for the youth, but it's also a positive for the officers that are able to participate. So if there is this movement to move officers out of the enforcement element, please, being sensitive to some of the trauma that some children may have, but be conscious of the fact that those positive interactions with non-enforcement type of activities pay lifetime dividends. People remember that police officer that came in, that police officer that taught my junior achievement class. I remember him. That's what I hope that, if we do get out of that role, which I hope we don't, but if we do, please continue to allow us to be in the schools and interact with the young people so they have that positive, not just the media narrative that they see quite a bit, but also that real face-to-face interaction that you can have with an officer, your local officer, not the officer down in 2 cities over or a couple states over, but your local one.
And speaking of local officers, the point was made earlier of Minneapolis not having many of their police force that live in the city of Minneapolis. So this community member has a question for both of our police chiefs. What % of your force live within your respective cities, Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center?
Well, I can start. When I first started, we had a number of officers that lived in the city. Right now, we do not. But another number to look at as well is how many police officers do you have currently that lived in your city, that were born and raised in your city, left and came back? We have a number of those officers that went to Brooklyn Center High School, that went to Park Center High School, that lived in Brooklyn Center. They're going to some of their old haunts when they were young, in their teens, and they are now policing that same community. So that matters as well, because if you were born and raised in the city and you came back to police it, that shows a commitment. So we have a number of those. We don't have the exact number, but it's more than 5 or 6 that have come back to police the city they were born and raised in. But right now, we do not have officers that live in our city.
We have a very small percentage. We do have going back to Chief Gannon's point, we do have several officers that were born and raised here that came back. And just, for the community, the officer's perspective as far as not living in the community that they work, it's not that they don't want to, but you have to realize from their perspective, they're human beings and they need time to step away from being a police officer. And I think they would openly tell you that if something were to occur to me off duty or were to get into some kind of conflict at the grocery store or whatever, I'm fine with that. But I'm not fine with that happening to my family right? Sometimes people think that officers don't need that time away to really disconnect from being hyper-vigilant as a police officer. It's actually, it's healthy, in my opinion, that they do need to turn off being a police officer from time to time. I know that this has been brought up several times and has been challenged in Minneapolis and other areas throughout the country about whether that requirement is even legal or constitutional. We may end up having that discussion once again, but I just wanted to share the perspectives at times that they do need to turn it off.
Now, this point was touched upon earlier when Chief Envelson, I believe it was you, when you spoke about the use of police force, and what we witness is something that is not written anywhere. So this community member would like to know, what are the use of force policies that you currently do have in place, and is this information accessible to residents who would like to see this policy?
Our use of force policy, as well as all of our policies, are online. They can be viewed. That'd be vehicle pursuits, deadly force, making complaints, how we handle domestic assaults. All that is online, and it's searchable, and it's on the actually city's website. We were one of the first agencies to put the entire policy manual online, so anybody can view it at any time. So if you want to see if what an officer did was appropriate, it's basically detailed as far as police patrol response. You look at that, you look at critical incidents, you look at that, and you can look at how the officer was supposed to respond in kind of big picture. But it's a tool. It's a tool that citizens can use, and it's fully searchable. So we have that currently. We've had it for a number of years now, and it gets updated. So it is out there.
Okay, Chief Envelson, did you want to?
Yeah, same here. If you go to our website and go into the police department section under open data, we have our entire policy manual there, as well as all of from past community meetings related to other incidents that have occurred. We have all of our traffic stop data on there as well. You can look at a map of where all the traffic stops occur in the city of Brooklyn Park going back to 2017, and it also breaks down the race and gender of who was driving that vehicle when the police officer pulled them over. We're in the early stages of getting our use of force data on the website as well. We're just having a little bit of a struggle with software issues that's above my ability, clearly, but that's something that we're going to have on our website as well.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to push a little bit beyond our time. We have many community members that are currently tuned in, and I want to be sure we get to all of the questions here this evening. So this one is to our police chiefs here tonight. And you have spoken about this earlier, but it's worth repeating for anyone who's tuned in later. So the question is, what type of in-person training surrounding bias are you and your officers exposed to? Does it deal with implicit and explicit bias?
The Post Board recently, within the last 2 years, enacted new post mandates that included some of those trainings. We're getting that training. We had training with that through the JCP, the Joint Community Police Partnership. We had a lot of that training to begin with, so it wasn't new to the Brooklyns, but now it is mandated. It's one of the post mandates that officers have to adhere to every 3 years. So they are getting more and more of that type of training. What we were doing independently is now being done across the metro and across all of Minnesota, so there are more trainers, but that is the type of training that we're seeing on a regular basis. And that's, I guess I don't want to speak for Craig, but I know that that's the training that we have, and we have to sign off on that training, and it's in person. We had a lot of discussions about, can it be online training, and those types of trainings are necessary to really have the one-on-one interactions, so we are still having those in-person trainings.
Same here. We started several years ago with implicit bias training, and to see if we were hitting the mark, we actually brought in some members of our Human Rights Commission that the mayor had spoken about earlier, for them to sit in on the training and provide their feedback after that. So we did that early on, and we made some adjustments based upon their feedback. But we've been doing implicit and explicit bias training for quite a few years.
Okay, so we are going to round this off with, I believe we have one final question here. And this one really speaks to systemic racism, systemic oppression. So this community member, I'll just go ahead and read it. There is a level of fear that is limiting youth of color from freely enjoying anything they desire. Stigmatizing and provocative policies starting from school, employment opportunities, and onward. So they ask, could you imagine why such feelings are prevalent and have existed for so long? It is because of prolonged conversation for the moment without any policy change or legislative action. So the question to all of you is, what is it that mayors, council members, chiefs, police chiefs could do? What can you do in your power to bring about change? What can you do in your power to bring about change?
I can start. We as elected officials, as mayor, as one of 5 that vote on our city council in Brooklyn Center, I can tell you that our city council is committed to looking at the policies that support and prop up systemic racism, which is pervasive throughout. I think we can all be honest about this, throughout the country, throughout our society. And it is these policies that continue to perpetuate the racism and the locking out of various communities from opportunity. And so we, as a city council, we're committed to evaluating, looking at these policies and modifying them, passing new policies so that we can get the change and increase access to opportunity for the people that live in our city, in Brooklyn Center. But I will say this, the power lies in the hands of the people who voted us in. And the people are also immensely powerful. They are the ultimate power. And so if you want to see change done in your city, in my city of Brooklyn Center, which I want to see, I need for you to rise up and come and meet and be a part of the process. I need for you to call me and call our city council members, to email us, tell us what you want to see, because when your voices are put forward, we have to listen to you. And so don't feel powerless. Feel that and know that you have the ultimate power, and that even if you don't wear the title of mayor or city council member, your voice is extremely powerful, even if you're only just one person. But believe me, if you feel passionate that you want to see the changes that are going to start to remove these barriers, know that there are other people who feel the same way as you do. And when you rise up, it will give courage to other people to rise up and come forward and demand the change as well.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to address that question before we get ready to close out?
Yeah, just briefly, I think that it's really important that I think it's very hard for 2 people to not like each other when they know each other. And so I always challenge people, have you talked to your neighbor? The answer is no. Well, why don't you? They're your first line of defense. 911 is still 3 or 4 or 5 minutes away. Your first line of defense is your neighbors watching out for you. So the more connected we get people, the more they talk, the more they realize that they have the same concerns in life and opportunity. And so I think that helps break down some of those barriers. And so I tend to be a little blunt with people. And so they'll call and say, hey, I saw a bunch of kids playing basketball in the park. I'm like, great, that's what a park is for. And I'd rather have them there playing basketball. But what they were really saying is, I saw kids that didn't look like me, that were playing basketball in the thing, and I think they're up to no good. That's what they were really saying, even though they didn't use those words. And so I try to challenge people to just, what's wrong with that? And so I think people sometimes, with that implicit and that explicit bias, we all do it, and we make assumptions based on things, and sometimes we have to evaluate our own lives. But I've seen so many things happen, the magic of the fact that we're all humans, that when people meet and talk and they discover something, the fact is they're very much the same. And that is probably the biggest way to break down. You can change a policy all day long you want, but if you can actually have your neighbor talk to the other neighbor, you will get farther along than any policy will ever take them.
Thank you. So, yes, Chief Engelson.
To respond to that, I would just really have two asks. So clearly I'm a white police chief of 108 officers, right? And my ask would be two things. One would be, to the extent possible, would be to evaluate and judge your police department, and don't apply a broad brush to everything that you see on the news across the country, across the state, and assume that that's what happens within your police department. And second would be to get involved. Right? I can make policy changes, I can make budget decisions, I can do all kinds of things on what I think could affect directly what your question was. Doesn't mean it's right. But I can tell you at times when we attempt to engage the community, related to body cams and some other things, not a lot of people show up. So we are left with making a decision on what we think would be the best for the communities that don't look like me. But if you want to become involved and look through these kind of issues and help us make those decisions, I'm all ears.
So as we get ready to wrap up our time together, final words of reassurance, and I actually would like to open this up to all of you, especially I'm looking at our chiefs, chief of police, because again, when the community has witnessed such an egregious act, right? The first thing they look at is our police. So I want to start with you both first. If you would just take 2 minutes each to address our community, any words of reassurance that you would like to give them, and then I'll move on to our mayors here.
Sure. Just in closing, I just want the residents of Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park to realize that both chiefs, all of our departments understand what occurred was wrong, unethical, illegal, and it's not what we do as police officers. We all recognize that. That's not the way policing should be done. That was wrong. It was criminal. Your local law enforcement train better than that. We treat people better than that, in that we are open to protests and to expressing yourself and opening up, and we'll listen. We are listening. Please express yourself. Some of the things that have happened in the later hours in Brooklyn Center have not been that, and it have been some things that have impacted the community in a negative way, and I don't believe they were done by community members. But the community has come together every morning to help clean up and put things back in order. I just hope that at this point in time that is done, that we can go beyond that and start building back up the partnerships that we had, and hopefully things that happen in other cities will not impact us as much as it has, because we've built up those relationships to begin with. But I just want to make sure that the citizens of Brooklyn Center know that we are working very hard to keep property and life safe during this time.
Chief Engelson.
So to the residents of Brooklyn Park, I shared with our city council on Monday that as your police chief, I 100% condone the criminal behavior that I saw occur a little over a week ago. It's also important for the residents to understand that to the officer in our building, they're all disgusted at what they saw. No one seems to think, or no one is trying to defend, justify, or explain the behavior of that police officer. And I'm not here to throw stones at Minneapolis, and I'm not, because I've never seen a department act as swiftly as they did. If you think back to some other cases, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, things went very slowly, both from an employment standpoint and both from the criminal standpoint. These guys were terminated. One is currently in Oak Park Heights. The other 3 are being criminally charged as we speak. So just, I leave you with that thought related to the video, and then second, going to a little bit about what Chief Gannon had said. Please work with us moving forward. We 100% respect your right to protest, and we understand it. But please work with us on doing it safely, both for you and for your fellow residents of Brooklyn Park.
Now to our mayors. Mayor Lundy, I will start with you, but if you would both share your last words, knowing that hopefully this session will continue again going forward, but what can you say to community members to reassure them?
Yeah, I think that, most importantly, I want to, thank everyone who's watching. People are going to watch a view for taking the time to get involved with this. This isn't how we prefer to do listening sessions, but with COVID, that other thing that hit us this year, the reality is that a lot of our lives have been thrown up in the air. Whether it's COVID, whether it's work, all these things are really causing angst and mental health challenges for all of us. And so I think going back to the basics, we all agree that the more we talk, the better off we'll be. The more we listen, the more we learn. And so the more we engage, the more we discover things that we need to know. And so for Brooklyn Park, that's how we've always held ourselves, is to engage, listen. And so this is part of that step. This is part of that process. There's not going to be some kind of like mile mark that says we're done. We are never going to be done. And so we're going to have to continue to work as hard as we can and to be open and honest. And I think that you will find that the elected leaders of either city is very much close to the ground. We're available. We're not sitting in offices. We are members of the community. We're out there. And so we will continue to work on this process. There is no easy answers. There's no quick solution. There is no fix that magically everyone will feel better. There's only good fixes that we continue to learn, listen, and engage with each other. And so that's why I commit on behalf of the city that we are on a journey that no one wanted to be on, but one that needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Elliott, what words do you have for community members?
Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castillo, George Floyd. George Floyd, George Floyd. My neck hurts, my back hurts, I can't breathe, everything hurts, they're gonna kill me. Those are the words we heard from a man that was murdered before our eyes. We must never forget what we witnessed. The moment is now, the time is now for us to take action to make sure that we are breaking down the systems that made that murder possible. Racism in our society, as we all know, is pervasive. And it's up to each one of us, black, white, all of us, all colors, all backgrounds, to step up and do what we can in each corner of the world where we exist to make sure that although on a daily basis it isn't, racism doesn't have the same, it's not to the same degree as we witness on our phones and our devices and on our computers and on our television with what happened with George Floyd. Racism beats communities down every day. As a young black man myself, I've experienced biking while black. I've experienced coming from a jog, getting on my bike, biking home, and squad car running up on the sidewalk to cut me off, and I fall over, guns drawn, back of the car. Several blocks back, I'm taken out of the car and shown to a lady in a house to be identified, simply because she noticed the back door of her neighbor's house was open at the same time that I was biking by. I had experience going into a store, coming out, getting in my vehicle, being pulled over less than a block, just immediately out of the parking lot, and asked the officer, why am I being pulled over? Well, sir, you came out of the store, you went back in the store, and you got in your vehicle. Simply returning the cart back into the store. But that was suspicious activity for some reason. My own police department, Brooklyn Center. High school. Myself, another peer of mine, and he's another young black man like myself, playing in a park with our other friends. We were the only two black kids. Out of nowhere, officers show up. They put the two of us in the back of the car, take us out about a block or so away, show us to a lady in a window to be identified. We were simply playing in a park. But we happened to be the only two black kids there, so we were put in the back of a vehicle, still in high school. This work is incredibly important. What happened with George Floyd happens on various levels every day in our society. And I don't think for 1 second that the officers in my department would do what that officer did in Minneapolis. But my point is that there are different levels that we all experience every day. So we have to be vigilant. We have to attack, reevaluate, review, look at those policies that keep these systems up. We are committed to keeping our community safe. That's why we've instituted the curfew, to make sure that neighborhoods are safe. Folks aren't driving through our neighborhoods with without license plates and breaking down businesses. And our curfew is going to be has been reinstated for tonight and into Friday. So we're committed to keeping our community safe. But part of that extends beyond just the protecting the physical buildings. We have to do the deep work within our community. We have to bring everybody together and work on the way forward. I have the full confidence that in Brooklyn Center and in Brooklyn Park, we're going to do this work. We're going to move forward as one people, because I've seen our communities come together to work together for one common cause. And I have all the confidence that we're going to get through this together.
Hope.
Absolutely.
Hope. That is something I try to remind myself and students and fellow colleagues to have that hope, because we must have it in order to move forward. So as we wrap up our time together, I want to thank everyone for listening in, all of our community members, your questions, your concerns. Know that we feel your pain. I feel your pain. Thank you, Chief Envelson, Mayor Lundy, Chief Gannon, and Mayor Elliott, for being here today and sharing your words during a time of grief and anger. But if anything, it starts at a conversation. But I also want to remind us all that let's use that energy, this momentum, to drive change forward, the change that we're all talking about and the change that our community members would like to see. And I would like to also encourage everyone to please complete the census. It's incredibly important for you to submit your information so that we can have all of the data necessary to provide the resources that are needed for the community. So again, thank you for your time, and this will not be our last time today, or going forward, we will see you again. Thank you.